welcome to Closer to Truth's collaboration with New Scientist, one of my favorite magazines. This is the warm-up for the New Scientist Big Thinker event, A New Science of Consciousness, with Anil Seth, the author of the new book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, now available for purchase. Buy it now by following the link in the description of this video. Anil is professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex. He is also co-director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Program on Brain, Mind, and Consciousness. He says his mission is to explain how consciousness happens and to use the insights from consciousness science for the benefit of medicine, technology, and science, and society. Please note that Anil's talk on the New Science of Consciousness and the New Scientist Lecture Series will be on September 9th. As New Scientist partner, CloserToTruth.com offers discounted tickets to this thought-provoking event. Anil, you offer a big vision. You state that it looks like scientists and philosophers, many of them who we feature on Closer to Truth, might have made consciousness far more mysterious than it needs to be. How so?
There's this temptation, I think, to treat consciousness as one big scary mystery in search of one grand eureka solution. And this challenge of consciousness has occupied thinkers, whether they're philosophers or scientists or biologists or theologians even, for centuries, because it does seem mysterious. How any kind of physical mechanism, be it a brain or a computer or anything made of stuff, how could anything give rise to any conscious experience at all, to the redness of red or the pain of a sharp toothache? I'm not saying there's no mystery there. There's a deep mystery. But instead of tackling it head on and trying to find, if you like, the special source that magics experience out of mere mechanism, there is a road for the science of consciousness to make a great deal of progress by simply accepting that consciousness exists. We know that it's very intimately related to the brain and the body. And we can start explaining the properties of consciousness, why experiences are the way they are, why they have the character that they have in terms of processes unfolding in the brain and the body. And by doing that, I think we can get a very long way towards a fully satisfying understanding of conscious experience.
Okay, well, we're going to be talking a lot about this, but why do you label the central problem of consciousness the real problem, drawing an obvious distinction with the hard problem that David Chalmers has used as his way of focusing our attention on the oddity of inner mental experience being generated by the physical clumps of wet matter we call brain?
That's right. So the term the real problem, I admit it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of a kind dig, I think, in tribute to David Chalmers, who as a philosopher has been enormously influential in the field. And indeed, he's most known for this distinction between the hard problem and the easy problems. And the hard problem is more like what we just said. It's treating consciousness as this big mystery. How does any kind of physical processing give rise to an inner life at all? As Chalmers said, it seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. So it's really the big mystery there that's in the crosshairs. And then the easy problems, as Chalmers and others describe them, are describing how the brain works as a mechanism, how it performs functions, how it leads to behaviors. These are not easy in the sense that the answers are coming anytime soon. They're easy in a more conceptual sense, that there's no evident obstacle for sort of explanations that we're used to in science working. The problem with cutting the cake this way is that the subjective experience gets kind of bracketed with the hard problem. You have to treat it as this big mystery, and it's not really part of the easy problems at all. So my favorite approach, this real problem approach, is to say, no, conscious experiences exist, they're real. I mean, some philosophers would sort of challenge that even. And they have properties. So my experience of vision is very different from my experience of an emotion. It's very different from my experience of intending to do an action. And these different experiences play different functional roles for an organism as well. They help us do different things. So the real problem approach is just trying to go beyond merely correlating different brain regions with different kinds of conscious experiences to try and explain something about why vision feels the way it feels in terms of the mechanisms that underlie visual experience. And the optimism here, the hope, and it is only a hope, is that by following this strategy, this hard problem of consciousness of Chalmers, it won't be directly solved, but it will be dissolved. It will gradually fade away, and the grand mystery of how consciousness comes to be part of the universe in the first place will no longer seem like the right question to ask.
Okay, well, that is a big statement, and there are many people who would challenge that, but we'll get to that later. I want to be really focus in on the distinction you make between the real problem and the easy problem, because easy is a funny word, but it's designed to be funny, and that means that we can discuss all the mechanisms of how things happen, how we hear, how we see, the interrelationships. But you're expanding that understanding of easy problem into real problem. What is that distinction?
It's a difference of emphasis, I think. So typically when we talk about the easy problems, we're talking about explaining the functions of systems, how inputs lead to outputs. We might try and explain the behaviors, the dispositions of people to say certain things, to do certain things. It's not really tackling what I would call, and what other philosophers might call, the phenomenology of experiences. So what I mean by that is every visual experience, for example, has a particular character. Things appear in a visual spatial field. Objects appear to have a certain three-dimensional existence, even if we can't see all the way around them at the same time. They appear in spatial relation to each other. Yet other kinds of experiences, for instance, in emotion, doesn't have a shape or a color, at least not in the same way that a visual experience does. It might do metaphorically, but not really. Emotions have valence. Things are good or bad, or likely to be good or bad in the future. And so there's this level of description that we can define for conscious experiences that the real problem is highlighting. It's how do we explain the properties of subjective experience in terms of mechanism, rather than just the functions or behaviors associated with the system.
So the key differentiation is taking consciousness as real and serious, still physical, of course, in your perspective, and then emphasizing the phenomenology as a critical part that needs to be explained. And in general, when people have used the term the easy problem, that may be lost in that translation.
That's exactly right. And indeed, I'm not the first person to put things in these broad terms. So there's this long-standing tradition dating back to for me, one of my heroes, Francisco Varela, the Chilean neuroscientist, who talked about neurophenomenology. Again, the idea of building explanations of the experiential character, the phenomenology of perceptual experience in terms of mechanisms. I guess my take on it is very similar. It's just sort of trying to be a bit more specific about what that might involve in terms of going beyond correlations to find actual explanations of why experiences are the way they are.
Yeah, I think that's very useful. Dave, I don't want to put words in Dave's mouth. He's very good friend of Closer to Truth. We have many interviews with him. People can watch on closertotruth.com or Closer to Truth YouTube channel. But I think Dave and his understanding would subsume all of those under the easy problem. But by focusing the real problem, as you've put it, on the phenomenology, I think it gives greater emphasis to a new approach to think about it. So I think it's a very useful distinction, even though others might think it was already subsumed.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That the easy problem is, if the easy problems are basically anything other than the hard problem, then indeed Yeah, the way I'm talking is encompassed by that. But within things that aren't the hard problem, there's a vast universe, a vast space of possible questions one could ask, and some of them have nothing to do with phenomenology, and others do. And I'm trying to just carve off this space of those questions that emphasize front and center phenomenology.
Good, and that's a very useful emphasis. You call a good starting point to distinguish, in understanding conscious, to distinguish between conscious level, conscious content, and conscious self. Why the tripartite division?
It's a little bit of a heuristic. It's a little bit arbitrary, I would admit, but it follows, again, this strategy of trying to shift from thinking of consciousness as a single mystery to thinking of it as a collection of related challenges. The analogy here is what happened with the scientific understanding of life. Instead of searching for the spark of life, the élan vital, life was naturalized by isolating and then explaining its different but related properties, things like metabolism, homeostasis, reproduction, and so on. And bit by bit, the hard problem of life was not solved but dissolved. And of course, consciousness is not the same thing as life. I don't want to be taken too literally here. But as a pragmatic strategy, I think it's still a valuable historical parallel. We can think about different explanatory targets within the broad field of consciousness and try to understand those, because they will be explained in different ways. And this distinction then between level, content, and self is just one way to do that. Conscious level identifies broadly one set of questions about what in the brain and the body underlies being conscious at all. What's the difference between being in a dreamless sleep or being in a coma or general anesthesia, let's say, and being awake and aware? You can address that question to some extent separately from the question of content. When you are conscious, what are you conscious of? What determines the nature of the perceptual scene that you enjoy or suffer from when you are conscious? And then finally, and I think it is worth separating out, because even though it's a subset of conscious content, the experience of being a self, the experience of being an individual, of course, this is what I lead to in the book. The book is called Being You. So this is where we go. We really use all the other ideas to try and understand how the experience of being an individual, being a self, happens. For many of us, that's the most central and important part of our mental lives, the experience of being a person.
Yeah, I think this is a very useful distinction, and it allows us to focus in on what questions we're really asking. On conscious level, I would look, from my background in neurophysiology, I would look upon that as almost a sleep and wakefulness, an attention wakefulness issue that has to be present in order for consciousness to exist. Conscious content, I think, is what normally we think about qualia, the inner feeling of what of the sense of what we feel, and then the conscious self is an extension of that, because to have a self, you must have conscious. So consciousness is kind of the foundation, and it's the ultimate product of what this all is, which is the point of your book, Being You, which I think is terrific.
Thank you. And I'm glad you put it that way around, actually, because you're absolutely right that being conscious at all is a precondition for conscious selfhood. But it's an open question whether the reverse is true. I mean, some people think that conscious selfhood is the essential part of being conscious. But of course, that may not be the case. Some low-level aspect of selfhood may be important, but you don't have to, at least I don't think, you don't have to be a full-fledged individual with a set of memories and a name, a full identity, in order to be conscious. Conscious selfhood is something that's built on the infrastructure of consciousness in general.
Yeah. This parsing of the meaning of consciousness, when it occurs, how it occurs, what it is, and the relationship to self, I think it's an extremely important part of the sort of the boundary between philosophy and neuroscience in achieving it. So the science of consciousness and the neural correlates of consciousness, they've been around, at least in my feeling, for more than 3 decades or so, in various associations that deal with the science of consciousness, neural correlates. Of course, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch around 1990 kind of used that term. People were doing things like that prior. I mean, I did my doctorate from 1964 to 1968. I was thinking with my professors in those terms without that specific phrase. So your claim is that there's something new here. So be precise in saying, what's the new part?
Well, I think it is an evolution of a lot of things that have gone before. So it's not something that is completely, dramatically new. I think the important shift is to go beyond correlation towards explanation. This has been one of the main criticisms of the neural correlates of consciousness approach. And this is the idea that correlations just adjust observations of things that relate. They in no sense provide an explanation of consciousness. They might constrain explanations, but they don't constitute a theory or an explanation. Mm-hmm. So the next step is to go a little bit beyond that and not only establish that particular brain regions or brain processes go along with distinctive aspects of consciousness, but understand why they do. I put this in the book in terms of explanation, prediction, and control. I mean, in science in general, if you're trying to come up with an account of a phenomenon, if you can explain its features, if you can predict when it will occur, when it will not occur, and if you can intervene to control it, you've basically done what a scientific account should be expected to do. And the challenge then is not just is how do you make that bridge? How do you go from mere correlation to explanation? And this is where theory comes in. And you're absolutely right that this more pragmatic approach that was initiated by people like Francis Crick and Christoph Koch and others 30 years or more ago, I mean, that was deliberately pragmatic because I think at that time, it was just before I was getting going, there was great value in showing that you could set aside a lot of the metaphysical and philosophical and theoretical disagreements and still do something useful. There was still something you could get in the lab and do. But now, 30 years later, there's a renewed appreciation and a need for theory to come in and start building correlations into satisfying explanatory frameworks.
Why is measuring consciousness important, and how is it done?
This is a topic I got interested in quite some years ago. It was on reading a book actually by a historian of science called Ha-Seok Chang about the history of our understanding of heat and how that depended entirely on the ability to develop thermometers, the ability to make measurements. I mean, we all know that science in general depends on making observations and testing our theories against observations that we get from experiments. But there's something very specific about measurement that goes beyond that. It's the idea that we can begin to quantify a phenomenon, put a number to it, and that can catalyze the transition between something being kind of mysterious, like heat was long ago. It was a substance that flowed between objects, to an understanding of what it actually is at a much more fundamental level. We all now know that heat is the mean kinetic energy. It's basically how fast molecules are moving within a substance. That's what heat is. To get to that understanding required thermometers, it required measurement. And it was not easy. Thermometers didn't exist for a while, and then when they did, people couldn't trust them. And so there was this challenge. How do you develop a reliable thermometer before you have a scale? How do you develop a scale until you have a thermometer?
So what is the thermometer for consciousness?
Well, that's the question, right? Is there one? So the first question is consciousness going to turn out to be something like heat? Is it going to be something that we understand, okay, behind and underneath its surface appearances, there's one thing that consciousness is, something equivalent to the mean molecular kinetic energy of molecules? Or is it going to turn out to be something else, like life, we've already mentioned as one possible parallel? The story of life didn't unfold that way at all. We don't measure life on a scale in the same way that we measure heat. We have like scales over evolution and so on. But there isn't an amount of life that a system has that we measure. Life is a collection of distinct properties that come together in different ways in different species and organisms. Now, I already suspect that consciousness is more like life than it is like heat. So I don't think we will necessarily get a consciousnessometer, a consciousness equivalent of a thermometer. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, because even if consciousness isn't fundamentally like heat, there are still ways in which it's useful to think of it as unfolding across a scale.
Certainly, it's a critical thing to do, if only for the medical purposes of evaluating people in comas and locked-in syndrome and all of the kinds of treatments and diagnoses of those of our species who are infirm. I mean, I think that's a very critical element. From a theoretical point of view, I could argue, though, that what you're measuring is the presence or absence or degree of it, as opposed to what it is.
Yes.
The degree of sleep or wakefulness or awareness or some other term. It's a critical thing to do, but I'm not sure how important it will be in the explanatory process.
I think that's an open question, and I think you're absolutely right that it is extremely useful. There are already existing measures that are based on theories about consciousness. So the most prominent one is called this Perturbation Complexity Index, developed by my friends and colleagues Marcello Massimini and Giulio Tononi. And they show that you can come up with a number that quantifies what happens in the brain when you inject a pulse of energy. It's basically like banging on the brain with an electrical hammer and listening to the echo, and then putting a number to how much that echo bounces around. Now, this turns out to be a very, very useful measure of conscious level that's already showing its value in hospitals, in the clinic, to diagnose cases where consciousness is present, even though the patients show no outward expression of it. But, and here's the key thing, I think, as you mentioned, is this really measuring consciousness itself, or something that is a good proxy, a good surrogate, but is not the thing itself? I think the second interpretation is more likely. But of course, we still learn a lot from this. It's still fascinating that conscious level varies in this quantifiable way.
Deriving from that, you highlight computing brain complexity as a breakthrough in the science of consciousness. How so?
I think it's a breakthrough because for one thing, it works. So this is one of these ways in which we have gone beyond brute correlation of this or that brain region being associated with consciousness to saying something deeper about the dynamics of brain activity and how they predict variations in conscious level. So calculating brain complexity can be done in many different ways. This is one of the things that with my colleagues here, Adam Barrett and Michael Shartner and others, we've been working on how do we, from observable brain dynamics, compute measures that reflect how quantifiably complex they are. Because it's a term itself that's quite slippery. It's not just the same thing as randomness. Complexity is this slightly slippery middle ground between order on the one hand and disorder on the other hand. And there are in fact many different ways where you can formalize, you can build mathematical measures that reflect part of that space. But I think it's particularly relevant to consciousness because of early work now by Giulio Tononi and my former boss, Gerald Edelman. In fact, it was one of the papers that I read in I think at about 1999, 2000, 20 years ago, that made me very excited about the potential for a neuroscience of consciousness, because they pointed out that every conscious experience at the level of, as we were saying earlier, at the level of phenomenology, has this property of complexity. It's both integrated into a unified whole and highly informative. Every experience that we have is one among a vast repertoire of possible experiences that we could have. And that's a super interesting observation about what conscious experiences are in terms of their phenomenological nature. And
Right,
then
well,
you can build measures that actually reflect that. And then you've gone beyond simple correlation towards explanation. And when these measures start to work in practice, then we're really getting somewhere.
good. We'll talk about integrated information theory a little bit later, but right now I want to focus on what I think is one of, if not your, critical insight in understanding the brain, and could be even a paradigm shift in re-envisioning the brain as a predictive perception machine. So what is the evidence for this, and what is the flow of the argument?
So this is actually a very old idea, so I by no means take credit for it. I've just sort of found it a very appealing framework in which to build explanations from mechanism to phenomenology, to sort of build these real problem style theories or accounts of consciousness. And the basic idea of the predictive brain starts way back in philosophy, but a usual starting point is Hermann von Helmholtz at the end of the 19th century, thinking about perception and realizing that when the brain is doing perception, when the brain's trying to figure out what's out there in the world, it's not simply reading out information that is unambiguously related to the world. It's not that the senses provide transparent windows onto an objective external reality. No. The outside world, the sensory data we get from it is uncertain, it's indirectly related to what's out there, it's ambiguous. In order to make sense of it, the brain has to do something we call inference. It has to combine this ambiguous sensory data with prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is, to then form its best guess about what caused the sensory information that it gets. In mathematics, we call this Bayesian inference. The brain is reasoning, if you like, it's reasoning backwards from the sensory data that it gets to what might have caused it, rather than reasoning forwards from what causes sensory data to the data that you get. This is a hard problem, this kind of reasoning backwards. And the brain solves this hard problem by making predictions and continuously updating these predictions. This is what we call predictive coding or predictive processing, and it's the general idea of the predictive brain. Now, this is kind of a paradigm shift, because it makes you think that it's natural to think that our perceptions are this sort of outside-in, bottom-up readout of sensory data. But the predictive brain turns that on its head and leads us to understand perception as a process of inside-out or top-down prediction, and the sensory data is just there to calibrate our predictions. That's certainly the theory anyway.
I think it's a fantastic concept. It was really made a very strong impression on me when I was speaking with Michael Masenovich, who developed a cochlear implant. And with a cochlear implant, with maybe at that point 1,000 different points of contact, there are probably a lot more now. Originally, the auditory nerve would have 1 million, but with even 1,000, if you've lost your hearing and you were able as a child to hear at one point, when you first get the implant, you hear just static, like a television set to a non-channel, just complete static. But if you're trained over several months, you can build back by that efferent downward information that the brain had, so that that static becomes more and more like normal sounds, and apparently can get back very close to traditional hearing, where you can distinguish words and have real understanding. And that is a remarkable process that I think is a proof positive of the predictive brain.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think we've all had or many of us had similar experiences where if you're learning a second language and maybe you visit the country, initially, when you hear people speak, it sounds like a continuous stream of uninterpretable noise.
Right.
But as you learn the language, it's not that you just understand what's going on. You hear things differently. This previous stream of sound becomes broken up into chunks, becomes broken up into words. I do think that's it's one level of evidence for the predictive brain at work. The challenge now is to is to see what's actually going on under the hood, because there are some quite strong claims made here that sensory signals, the stuff that comes into the brain from the outside, whether it's the eyes or the ears, is largely prediction error, and the stuff going the other way is largely prediction, and that the contents of our perceptual experience are built from the latter, from the perceptual predictions.
Well, we certainly have hierarchies in the sensory process, from the periphery to the midbrain to the thalamus to the cortex. So there are different opportunities for this type of downward impact to have anatomical location.
That's right. And there are certain weird facts about anatomy that start to make sense when viewed this way. And one of the strangest facts is that in the perceptual hierarchies of the brain, there are more connections going back out towards the senses than there are going into the center of the brain. And that doesn't really make sense if you think of perception as being largely this bottom-up readout process.
Right.
But it makes all sorts of sense if, in fact, most of perception, the heavy lifting, is done through these top-down connections. And there's other evidence. So some of the experiments that we've been doing in my lab at Sussex have looked at manipulating perceptual predictions and seeing how that affects people's perceptual experience. So like a very, very simple example is that people, we find in certain contexts anyway, that people see more accurately and more quickly things they are expecting to see than things that violate their expectations. So when the sensory data line up with the perceptual predictions, it sort of settles into a concrete best guess more quickly. This is all behavioral evidence. So the real challenge, and we're doing this and other groups are doing this too, is to now look inside the brain to see if we can see the neural fingerprints of predictive processing at work.
I like your phrase that perception is a controlled hallucination.
Well, again, I'm not going to take credit for it. I heard it. I love the phrase. And although I do get quite a lot of stick for it from time to time, I first heard this from one of my mentors, really, Chris Frith at UCL, and he heard it from somewhere else. And, I've sort of taken it to heart. For me, it highlights two essential things about perception. The hallucination part of it highlights that all our perceptual experience comes from within. We don't just read out what's out there in the world. It's internally generated, and of course it shares that with a common understanding of what hallucination is. Hallucinations we do recognize as coming from within, but the controlled part is just as important as the hallucination part. So when I say perception is a controlled hallucination, I'm not saying that anything goes or it's all made up or the real world doesn't exist. Not at all. Perception is an active construction that is very, very tightly reined in by the world. And we would have to be, otherwise it wouldn't be useful for us.
Sure.
So it's controlled by sensory signals, but there is this continuity between the two. Hallucination is not a completely distinct thing from normal perception. To the extent that our perceptual predictions become overly strong, they'll start to lose their grip on the world. And as they progressively lose their grip, then we might start calling them hallucination. So just as we can say perception is controlled hallucination, we could equally say that hallucination is uncontrolled perception.
Going the other direction, if we start with hallucinations in psychotic individuals, schizophrenia and other mental illness, could predictive processing and understanding that help in a clinical way with therapies that utilize predictive processing to understand why those hallucinations are occurring and potential interventions?
Yes, very good. That's the hope. And in fact, one of the papers that I read that really got me involved in this area was by Chris Frith and a psychiatrist at Cambridge called Paul Fletcher, who were explaining how psychotic hallucinations, sorts of hallucinations that might appear in schizophrenia, could be accounted for in this way, that you have aberrant or abnormal perceptual predictions that get out of hand, and then on the basis of that, people build false beliefs about what's going on in the world. I think there's a great potential there. One of the things we're doing in my lab now, in fact, is trying to get more specific in a predictive processing framework about different kinds of hallucinations. So there are the sorts of hallucinations that sometimes accompany psychosis, which can be often very vivid, very complex. There are people, there are narratives, there are streams of thought. There are psychedelic hallucinations that accompany the intake of psychedelic drugs that can be very visually vivid, but also maybe be distortions of what's going on actually out there in the world. Visual seeds can morph into other things. And then in neurological conditions like Parkinson's disease and certain kinds of dementia, Lewy body dementia, other kinds of hallucinations happen. Now, we use the word very broadly in all these cases, but actually the phenomenology, to get back to that term again, is very different for these different kinds of hallucinations. So we've been trying to drill down to understand what specific alterations to a predictive coding mechanism could give rise to different kinds of hallucination. This is a method that we've been calling computational phenomenology, building computational models of phenomenology. So it's just like this real problem approach. Yes. And then the hope is that maps onto actually what's happening in the brains of people that are having these different hallucinations. And that's where we're going with it. So I think there's definite potential for understanding different kinds of altered conscious experience in psychiatric conditions. The extent to which that's going to translate into interventions is a big leap. I mean, this is always an obstacle. I hope it does. I think there are some early signs with various sorts of feedback training that it might. But certainly an explanation of what's going on is a precondition for any effective intervention. Now, I like to think of it as in medicine, for certain sorts of diseases, we've gone from treating the symptoms to getting at the mechanisms. If you have a fever, you can start off just by taking paracetamol or Advil or something, which will just suppress the symptoms. But if you want to knock it out completely, you might take an antibiotic, and that gets at the causes. And in psychiatry, it's still mainly about treating the symptoms and very little about treating the underlying causes. So what we need is a sort of set of antibiotics for psychiatry, and we're not going to get there unless we have a detailed, precise understanding of the mechanistic basis of the symptoms of psychiatric conditions.
How does your work articulate with what we spoke about before, integrated information theory, originated, of course, by Giulio Tononi and supported strongly by Christoph Koch?
So in my work, it's almost we have two semi-independent things going on. So a lot of the work I'm interested in is based on this predictive processing framework, taking that forward. But I've had this long-standing interest in integrated information theory too. In fact, I first moved to, I'm at Sussex now, but I spent 6 or 7 years in San Diego as a postdoc, motivated almost entirely by Giulio Tononi and Gerald Edelman's early work on complexity, which later became IIT, Integrated Information Theory. So with some of my colleagues here, we do work on it, but we have a slightly different perspective because for Giulio's group, again, not to put words in his mouth, but my reading of Giulio's perspective is that he's trying to solve the hard problem of consciousness. He's trying to draw an identity between brain complexity as measured by integrated information and consciousness. Now, this is a very ambitious thing to do. I'm glad somebody's doing it, but I'm glad it's not me, because there's a cost to doing that. And the cost is the measures that you come up with of integrated information become very, very difficult to test. You very informally, you have to see all the things a system could do, even if it doesn't do them. This is a really hard thing to do for any system that is not really, really simple. So I like to take some of the same basic insights that every conscious experience has this character of being unified and is also very informative, and just take that as a sort from a real problem perspective. Not say that that's what consciousness is, but this is a really strong, potentially universal property at the level of phenomenology of conscious experiences. And what might be the neural fingerprints or signatures of that? What kinds of measures can we develop that track integrated information in a way that doesn't assume that that's what consciousness actually is. And it turns out if you take that slightly weaker view, you can get measures which are much easier to develop and deploy in practice.
As I've read your work, and I've appreciated it greatly, in the light of integrated information theory, I see integrated information theory as really kind of a barbell approach. On one hand, they're measuring the extent of consciousness, phi, how much consciousness there is, and at the other extreme, there's this theory of not how much consciousness there is, which is phi, but what it really is, and they have some multi-dimensional n-space structures that exist somehow. I'm not sure if it's Platonic heaven or where, that are this virtual infinite number of total integrated experiences. So there's that model of what it is and the measure. And I see your work as in between. I'm not sure there are links, but your work, as you call the real problem, is what happens in the middle.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. Certainly, integrated information theory as a whole is really ambitious because it is trying to explain not only how much consciousness there is, but also, as you say, the specific phenomenology of any given conscious experience has some shape or some point in a massively multidimensional space. That's extremely difficult to test, part of IIT. There are some potentially interesting implications that do follow from it, though. There's this sort of fascinating idea in IIT that if you change the structure of a mechanism, that will change the experience, even if the activity, the dynamics remain the same. This is kind of counterintuitive, but it follows from a strong reading of IIT. And I quite like the fact that you can draw some testable predictions from it. But certainly, one of the things I think about is how does it relate to predictive processing? And that's a really tough question. It's not very clear how the two theories go together. It's something we've been thinking about for a long time. In fact, I've been at meetings where there have been people from both predictive processing and IIT together and struggling with this kind of question. I think that's still very much open.
From given all that you have proposed, you have come to a vision of what the self is. So what is the self?
The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. So this is the first thing to say, that this I think the trajectory of my understanding broadly of consciousness has been this progressive undermining of the way things seem as a guide to how things are. So when we think about perception of the outside world, it really seems as though there are objects that have properties like color and shape and so on. It seems as though these things exist in a way that doesn't depend on a mind. Now, some properties do exist in a way that doesn't depend on the mind, but others don't. Color requires a mind. And it's also easy to assume that the self is a thing that exists, maybe somewhere inside my head, somewhere inside my body, and is the essence of me that is the recipient of all this sensory information, that is the thing that does the perceiving. But I think a better way to think about it, and again, this has roots that go way back, in this case, for me, go back to Hume and his so-called bundle theory of perception, the Scottish philosopher from hundreds of years ago, that the self is a perception too. The self is a series of interconnected perceptions, perceptions of the body from the inside, perceptions of the body in space, perceptions of a first-person perspective, perceptions of actions and of intentions to perform actions. There are lots of things that together end up underpinning the overall experience of being a self. But it's not a single indivisible thing. And we know this too. We've known this for a long time. People like Oliver Sacks have beautifully pointed out, illustrated with case studies, that this apparent unified nature of a self can come apart in all sorts of ways. People can lose aspects of it. They can lose the experience of the body. They can lose the experience of free will. They can have out-of-body experiences. And it's just that in normal life, we experience these things as all bound together. But that doesn't mean that's how they actually are in terms of the brain basis of selfhood. Altogether, I think of the self as a collection of perceptions at multiple different levels. So at the very lowest level, there is just the perception of being a body. And this is a perceptual prediction that is regulating the interior of the body. It's this basic sense of being alive, of being an embodied organism. Then there's the experience of having a body, the experience of the body as an object in space. On top of that, there's the experience of a first-person perspective, a point of view on the world. Then on top of that, there's experiences of intention and agency, of volition, of intending to do things we typically call with a slightly slippery word, free will. And then only after that, I think we get to the self as a sense of personal identity, where I put a name and a set of memories to who I am. And the very highest levels of selfhood, my mind, my sense of identity is, of course, refracted and reflected through the minds of others. This is the social, the cultural influence on selfhood. But of course, in everyday life, this is a bundle of perceptions that I experience as being unified, and that's what a self is.
Well, that's very good. So how do all these selves, the bodily self, the perspectival self, the volitional or free will self, and even the narrative and the social selves, how do they integrate together? How do they articulate?
That's a really good question. We know that they can come apart. So this is the lesson from psychiatry, from neurology, and increasingly in the lab, it's been fascinating to try and tease apart these different elements of selfhood. You need to know how they come apart before you know how they combine together. So one of the classic experimental demonstrations that dissociates one aspect of selfhood is this thing called the rubber hand illusion, which is a very, very popular demonstration in which you have a fake hand and you show it to a person, they hide their real hand, and then the experimenter might stroke both the fake hand and the real hand at the same time. And many people, when they are focusing on the fake hand and they see it being stroked and they feel stroke because their real hand is being stroked, they might say that, that fake hand feels a little bit like my real hand. And this is demonstrating the malleability of one aspect of selfhood, this experience of body ownership. But in fact, some of the work we've been doing in the lab is revealing that this cornerstone of the psychology of the embodiment is not quite so simple. It depends very strongly and maybe entirely on what people expect to experience. So in this particular example, people know implicitly what's going on and what they should experience. And that turns out to be a very strong driver in what actually happens. But that's the general process. We can tease apart in experiments different ways of isolating these different aspects of selfhood.
Are there implications for understanding the persistence of personal identity, which has been a long-standing philosophical problem?
Right. Am I the same person now that I was? And I was thinking about this the other day. I went to central London for the first time since since 2019. And that's something I used to do all the time. It's an hour's train ride from my home in Brighton. Am I the same person? A lot has changed. And in some ways I'm different, but I still experience myself as being continuous. It's a very old philosophical problem. As you know, the cells in my body turn over, but I still feel a sense of continuity of identity. One thing I think that's going on here, which I'm not sure has been that much studied, is that there's an analog, or I think there's an analog, to what in external perception is called change blindness. Many demonstrations in perception, visual perception, let's say, show that if things in the world change very, very slowly and we are not paying attention to the changes, we don't notice the change at all. Our perception changes, but we don't perceive the change. This is change blindness. My suspicion is something very, very similar is happening with respect to the perception of self, that it's changing all the time, but we don't perceive the change. And I think this is actually for very good reasons, because the reason we have experience of the selfhood in the first place, you have to ask this question, like, why do we experience being a self? What's the point? One answer to that is that perceiving the self is for regulating the self. It's for controlling the self. It's fundamentally for staying alive. We perceive ourselves in order to control the body, in order to continue staying alive, very, very basically. So in that sense, expecting the perception of self to remain stable over time is a very, very adaptive, a very, very useful thing to do.
So given this understanding of the self and the persistence of personal identity, what are the implications for so-called mind uploading, relocating our first-person consciousness and non-biological materials to achieve so-called virtual immortality?
I think this is one of the craziest ideas that's doing the rounds these days. I mean, you can kind of understand its appeal. I mean, who doesn't want to? Well, I don't want to live forever, but this idea that we might is, I guess, has some basic low-level fundamental appeal. But it's all based on this metaphor. I think this quite tired metaphor now that the brain is some kind of computer and that consciousness and the self is a sort of software or mindware that's running on the wetware of the brain. And that could be abstracted and uploaded into the cloud or wherever it wants to go. Now, I just think this is a dramatically unlikely proposition. It's not just that it's hard to measure all the relevant patterns of information flow in the brain. There's a fundamental assumption at play here, which is that consciousness and self is what we might call substrate independent, that it doesn't matter what kind of system is giving rise to it, whether it's biological or whether it's silicon. Now,
that's a functional in philosophy. Functionalism in philosophy. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is this quite common view of functionalism that consciousness is a matter of information processing. You often hear this, but I get very worried. I think there's a big red flag whenever I hear this. It's a very easy thing to say, but it conceals a lot of very strong assumptions. The strongest being that consciousness is indeed just a form of information processing. But as many philosophers have pointed out, there's no reason why this should necessarily be the case. You know, there are some things which, if you simulate them on a computer, it actually gives rise to the thing. A computer that plays chess is actually playing chess. But there are other things where just capturing the information processing part, simulating it, is not the same thing as generating it. You simulate a complex weather system, it doesn't get wet and windy inside the computer doing the simulation. So is consciousness more like the weather? Is it more like playing chess? Well, just to be intellectually honest, I don't know the answer. I just am very worried about leaping to the assumption that functionalism has to be true, that consciousness is something that you can strip out of a living system and put up in the cloud somewhere. We are fundamentally, we're living flesh and blood machines. My view of consciousness has emphasized, somewhat to my own surprise, when you follow it all the way through, this idea of predictive processing, modeling the world, and then also regulating the body, there doesn't appear to be any bright line, any clear distinction between when the wetware stops and the mindware starts. It's kind of continuous all the way down. And if it's continuous all the way down, if there's no clear separation of levels as there is in a computer, then the prospect of uploading becomes very problematic. What do you upload without rebuilding the whole system out of the same parts? So I'm very deeply suspicious both of the prospects of mind uploading, but I'm also very suspicious of the motivation for doing it. Well, why should we want to freeze our persons and our mental state in time and have it completely separated from our nature as living creatures?
It's fascinating that in all the discussion of mind uploading among what I call techno-optimists, there's almost no discussion of whether it's in principle possible. It is assumed as an obvious assumption that it can be done in their whole approach. But the way I like to look at it, mind uploading, as you've been articulating, is a very powerful probe of what consciousness is by trying to understand that. So I think it's more than a frivolous topic. I think it's a deep probe of what consciousness is.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the easiest way to do mind uploading is probably to have children. Then you recreate something of your own mind in something that's made out of the same stuff. But you're absolutely right that this taking for granted is quite troubling, and you see it also in some other situations. It's there in this assumption that artificial intelligence is on an inevitable trajectory towards conscious machines, that there'll be some threshold of intelligence at which the inner lights come on and our AI systems, our latest iPhone, the new Siri or Alexa or whatever it is, actually has experiences. And this is, it may be true, but it rests on a very, very unsupported assumption that consciousness is both independent of the material and also that it's strongly related to intelligence. And I think that latter assumption speaks more to the sort of human hubris that we often bring to these discussions, this desire to put us front and center of everything. We think we're intelligent. We know we're conscious. So we think that the two go together almost inevitably or constitutively.
I've argued that whether AI can be conscious and whether we can mind upload are not two separate questions. They are the same question because they both are fundamentally related to what consciousness is.
Yes, they share this very core assumption that consciousness is some abstract information processing, something that's independent of the substrate. That's absolutely right. They also, the idea of mind uploading, though, I think it has something else. It also removes the body entirely. And for our experience of being a self, even if it does turn out to be substrate independent, in practice, it's so influenced by, shaped by, co-constructed with our physical body. So you might have to upload a robot as well as the mindware of your brain, even if, as I think is probably unlikely, consciousness is some sort of information processing. I just think that metaphor is getting weaker and weaker and weaker as the computational metaphor of mind as a whole begins to lose its collective grip on our ways of thinking.
And Neil, let's have some fun at the conclusion here and look at now the hard problem, which you've avoided because it is so philosophical. But at the end of the day, aren't all the different explanations of consciousness a kind of identity theory that you have to claim, whatever you think it is, that is consciousness, that the inner experience is something, the firing of C fibers in pain in the body, or these abstract multidimensional structures in integrated information theory. At the end of the day, something has to be this consciousness.
That's the hope. I think that the challenge is that no identity theory yet seems very satisfying. Maybe IIT is at least the richest, but it's really difficult to test, and even then, it doesn't seem that it's necessarily gonna work out that way. But the question for me is, what's the best way to approach that kind of identity theory? Of course, there are some philosophical positions which say no, that's the wrong way to think about it. There's panpsychism, which would say, no, consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. It's all over the universe. But for me, panpsychism, the problem isn't that it's crazy. The problem is it doesn't explain anything and it's not testable. And then on the other hand, you've got the perspective that we're just completely mistaken about consciousness being real in the sense that we commonly think it is, that we're just mistaken about there being something distinctive about perceptual experience, about quality. There is nothing other than mechanism. I'm still in the middle, trying to retain what I think is the central starting point, that consciousness is real. Conscious experiences are a feature of the universe. In fact, they're the most obvious features of the universe for any of us. That's all we know. And that they depend on mechanisms in some way. Whether we get to a fully satisfying identity relation, as we have done with heat, that would be brilliant. But we might not get there. So life has a complicated relationship to identity theories. It's not identified with any single one other thing. It's a constellation. It comes about as a constellation of different properties. There are gray areas. Some things are only partly alive. It may well be that consciousness turns out to be something like that, for which there isn't a brute identity with some other thing in the universe.
Anil, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I hope our audience did too. And for those who are interested in more, I know I can't wait for your live event at New Scientist, Closer to Truth's partner, on September 9th. Anil will draw on his original research to offer an exhilarating new theory about how we experience the world and generate the self. Visit closertotruth.com for more information and for discounted tickets. And you can purchase Anil's new book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, by clicking the link in the description of the video below. Thank you, Anil. Look forward to seeing you on September 9th.
Thank you, Robert. It was a real pleasure. Absolutely delightful.